We were given one rule before entering the abandoned subway line. Do not whistle. I've spent 6 years working as a maintenance tech for the city subway system. When I first started, I thought the job was simple. Swap out burnt-out light bulbs, check the wiring, patch up the occasional water leak. But working down there in that thick, absolute darkness teaches you something real quick. The underground doesn't play by the rules of the surface world. It belongs to a much older, much more brutal reality. My name is Tyler. I didn't take this job out of some romantic love for the underground. I just needed the money, and the pay was good. While normal people walked under the sun during the day, I'd lose all track of time in the tunnels. Down there, there's no daylight, no clocks. There is only sound, and sometimes the terrifying absence of it. My partner was Miller. He was about 10 years older than me, his hair prematurely graying, his skin permanently stained a dusty subway gray. He knew those subterranean labyrinths like the back of his hand. The strangest thing about Miller was that he never asked questions. It was like he knew that not asking was a hell of a lot safer than hearing the answer. I used to think he was just a coward. Later I realized it was pure survival instinct. The day they assigned us to the black line, the usual locker room chatter instantly died. That name wasn't a joke among the transit workers. It was always spoken in hushed, careful whispers. It was a tunnel system built in the 1920s, shut down after an unexplained cave-in. Wiped from the official maps and stamped as non-existent. Officially, there was nothing down there. Practically, well, rumors said, lights flickered in the dark, and strange noises echoed out. Sometimes the guys sent down there just never came back. Our foreman called us into his office, tossed a yellowed, faded blueprint onto his desk, looked us dead in the eye, and said just one thing. There is only one rule down there: absolute silence. No talking, no joking around. And for God's sake, whatever you do, do not whistle. I smirked. Miller just nodded. Like everyone else, I figured it was just some old workplace superstition. Acoustics, gas leak risks, pressure differentials. My brain immediately scrambled for a logical explanation. Human beings love inventing logic because it's easier than believing in an unknown, looming horror. But the black line doesn't care about logic. Me, Miller, and 2 other techs, Jackson and Lee, were riding a rusty, ancient utility elevator down into the dark. The lift rattled and groaned, shaking as if something beneath the earth was dragging us down into its maw. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone and wet, rotting iron. Jackson looked down at his phone screen and snickered. Man, if they have Wi-Fi down here, I might just move in. Save a fortune on rent. Lee gave a nervous laugh. Stay down here for 10 minutes and you won't even remember what the word Wi-Fi means. Miller didn't laugh. He just leaned against the metal wall, chewing on an unlit cigarette, his eyes glued to the elevator doors. I looked over at him. You're always this quiet? He shrugged. Silence is part of the job down here. Jackson grinned and leaned forward, his voice echoing off the metal enclosure. So what you're saying is, if someone calls my name down there, I shouldn't answer? Come on, that's just rude to the subway goblins. Miller's gaze turned ice cold. Pray that nothing calls you. The entrance to the black line was a heavy, riveted iron door. The faded red paint scrawled across it looked like dried blood. Restricted access structural instability. Jackson slapped the iron door. Classic. Every cheap horror movie starts exactly like this. Lee swallowed hard. Yeah, right before the monster jumps out. We unlocked the heavy deadbolts. The door groaned in protest as we shoved it open. Inside, there was no sound. No dripping water, no airflow. Just a total crushing void. It felt as though sound itself had been strangled and left to die in that tunnel. Jackson stared into the blackness, pursed his lips, and suddenly let out a sharp, piercing whistle. The sound sliced through the tunnel like an arrow stretching out into the dark before slowly dying away. I swear this place is just an empty parking lot, Jackson laughed. In a flash, Miller pinned Jackson by his collar, slamming him hard against the brick wall. Do not whistle. What the hell is wrong with you, man? Jackson shoved him off. Who's going to hear us down here? The rats? Miller didn't answer. There was deep, paralyzing terror in his eyes, far worse than anger. He slowly turned around and began walking into the dark. The first few hours went by with standard maintenance work. The beams of our flashlights barely cut through the gloom, illuminating thick clouds of dancing dust. Everything seemed normal. Suddenly, Jackson dropped his wrench. He stood up straight, freezing in place. Hey guys, I think someone's calling me. Lee let out a tense laugh. Who's calling you? The collection agency? Jackson shook his head, his face completely pale. I'm serious. There's a voice coming from further down. It's saying my name. From behind us, Miller's voice cut through the dark, cold and ruthless. Keep working. Do not look up. Ignore it. By the time our break rolled around, we were all exhausted. We sat down in a small concrete electrical cutout. Even as we pulled out our lunches, everyone tried to keep as quiet as possible. Even Jackson had gone silent. But then, Jackson pulled a pair of orange foam earplugs from his pocket and tried to stuff them into his ears. Suddenly, Miller lunged forward and snatched them right out of his hands. What is your problem? Jackson snapped, jumping to his feet, his voice echoing loudly in the cramped space. Don't put those in. You don't own my ears, man. My head is pounding. I just want some damn quiet. Miller stepped into Jackson's space, standing inches from his face. He spoke so quietly his words felt like dripping poison. It is dangerous to be deaf down here. Sound comes into this place, but it doesn't leave. Do you understand? If they realize you can't hear them, they will come closer. A suffocating silence fell over the room, and then from right inside the concrete wall we were leaning against came a faint sound. Tap. Jackson whipped his head around. Did you guys hear that? Tap, tap. This time it was closer, clearer, like someone was striking the concrete with something hard and solid, like a bone. Then something else happened. A voice drifted in from the distance. It sounded human, but the words were garbled, mangled. It sounded like someone trying to speak while choking, their mouth packed with dirt. The voice grew clearer. We're here. Every hair on my arm stood on end. Lee took a step back, his flashlight trembling violently in his hand. No way. Is this real? It's just an echo of our own voices, right? Jackson, tell me it's a radio interference. Jackson stepped toward the wall, looking completely hypnotized. Who's out there? He yelled. Stop! Miller lunged to grab him, but he was too late. Jackson pressed his ear right against the freezing concrete. 1 second. 2 seconds. The expression on his face shattered. His smirk vanished. His eyes dilated with sheer horror. They say they know us, he whispered. What are they saying? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. Jackson stared blankly into the void. It's my mom's voice. She's calling my name. She's telling me it's so cold inside. Miller grabbed him by the jacket and violently threw him to the floor. What the hell are you doing? Jackson shrieked. Miller leaned over him, hissing through gritted teeth. They don't want you. They want your answer. You just gave yourself to them. Behind the wall, the noise erupted. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was several, maybe dozens of people, whispering, letting out wet, raspy laughs, scratching their fingernails against the concrete. The tunnel was drowning in the sound. We were completely surrounded. Then, instantly, it all stopped, like a knife cutting a thread. A dead, suffocating silence fell over us. Our flashlights began to blink and sputter. And from the exact center of that darkness, from the deepest point of the tunnel, a sound came back to us. It was a sharp, short whistle, the exact same whistle Jackson had let out hours ago. But this time, someone or something was whistling it back at us, incredibly slow, incredibly deliberate. Jackson's jaw trembled. Tears began streaming down his face. This is a messed up prank, he whispered, though he didn't believe his own words anymore. Lee bolted toward the exit. I'm getting the hell out of here. Open the door. Miller grabbed him by the arm, locking him in place. His hand went down to the heavy iron pipe wrench on his tool belt. Staring straight into the blackness, he said something I will never forget. Do not run, not yet. If we move now, they will play with us. But Jackson wasn't listening to us anymore. He slowly got to his feet. His eyes were wide, but they looked entirely blank, like a blind man's. He looked right past us, staring intently into the pitch-black void behind us. My mom is crying. She's all alone. I can't leave her down there, he muttered. He took a step forward, straight into the dark. Jackson, stop! I lunged for him, but Miller threw his arm across my chest, holding me back with terrifying strength. It's too late, Tyler, he answered. Jackson stepped into the shadows. The beam of his flashlight danced frantically against the brick walls for a few seconds, and then it abruptly died. Just moments later, a wet, sickening sound echoed from the dark. It sounded like someone ripping a massive piece of raw meat away from the bone with a dull butcher knife. There was no other sound. Jackson didn't even scream, just a wet gasp and the horrific crunch of snapping bones. Lee dropped to his knees, clapping his hands over his mouth, but the sheer terror inside him broke through, and he let out a piercing shriek. Jackson! Huge mistake. Before Lee's scream could even finish echoing off the walls, dozens of different voices blasted back from the darkness. They were all mimicking Lee's exact voice, but distorted, warped into a demonic mocking pitch. Jackson, Jackson, Jackson! A thick, black liquid began dripping from the tunnel ceiling onto our heads. Our flashlights died completely. We were plunged into total, absolute darkness. The only thing left was the pathetic, dim beam of the small backup light in my pocket. When I switched it on and aimed it at the floor where Lee had just been kneeling, he was gone. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, just his flashlight dropped on the tracks, still rolling in a slow circle. I froze. I couldn't even draw breath into my lungs. Miller's hand, hard as iron, clamped down on my arm. We run. No matter what you hear, do not look back. Don't breathe too loud. Run. We bolted back toward the lift. We didn't hear the sound of footsteps chasing us. No, what we heard was much worse. It was the sound of bones scraping against concrete. the sound of something slithering along the walls and across the ceiling, keeping pace right above us. When we hit the heavy iron door at the entrance, Miller threw me through the opening. But he stayed on the other side, pulling the massive iron door shut from the inside. "Miller, get in here," I screamed. He looked at me through the narrowing gap. For the first time, there was no fear on his face, just a bizarre, disturbing peace. "I've been a part of this place for a very long time, Tyler," he said, and then he smiled. But it wasn't Miller's smile. It was a wide, jagged, completely unnatural grin that stretched too far across his face. And behind him, out of the darkness, dozens of pale, hollow faces materialized. Every single one of them was wearing Miller's smile. He slammed the door shut. The heavy iron latch dropped into place with a deafening clang. I sprinted to the elevator alone, slamming my fist against the button like a madman. As the elevator doors began to slide shut, I heard the heavy iron door below violently splintering apart. All the way up the dark shaft, a chorus of whistles followed me. The sounds gradually shifted, morphing into my own voice, calling my own name up the shaft. "Tyler, Tyler, come back down." The official incident report stated that Jackson and Lee were caught in an accidental tunnel collapse. The search and rescue teams spent weeks down there, but they never recovered the bodies. As for Miller, when HR went to pull the archives, they found out that no one with the last name Miller had ever been employed by the transit authority. The supervisor, his face completely bloodless, stared at me and tossed the paperwork across the desk. "Tyler, what the hell are you talking about? Only you, Jackson, and Lee went down to that line. There was no fourth man. I quit the job that very day. I didn't even go back to collect my final paycheck. Now I live far away from the city, in a small town on the surface where the sun is always shining. I chose an apartment on the 3rd floor just so I can have solid concrete beneath my feet instead of dirt. I live with the diagnosis of severe PTSD. Antidepressants and sleeping pills are my only real friends now. I leave every single light on at night. I'm so terrified of the quiet that I keep either the TV or the radio running 24/7. Because whenever the world goes truly silent, my mind drifts back to that absolute void beneath the concrete. Taking the subway or even walking through an underground pedestrian tunnel is completely out of the question for me. If I catch even a faint whiff of damp concrete or rusty iron on the street, my throat tightens up and my heart hammers against my chest like it's trying to break free. I don't see ghosts. Nothing supernatural happens to me out here. But the second I close my eyes, I see Jackson smiling as he walks into the dark. I hear Lee's scream dissolving into nothingness, and worst of all, I see the missing man, Miller, wearing that strange, impossibly wide grin. A ritual my family performed when I was a depressed teenager. I grew up in India. And when I was in 11th grade, I was going through one of the worst periods of my life. My health wasn't good. I was constantly depressed, crying often, and felt like I was slowly losing control of myself. Looking back, I was in a very bad mental state. My family strongly believed in spiritual causes for these kinds of problems, including black magic, evil spirits, and curses. Because of that, they called a local spiritual healer who was known for dealing with these situations. When he arrived, he checked my pulse and spent some time observing me. After that, he told my family that there was definitely some kind of negative spiritual influence around me. He also said that it could have been caused by black magic done by jealous relatives or someone who wished us harm. Before this happened, our house already contained various religious and spiritual items. Some came from Hindu traditions, while others had been given to us by Muslim Babas who claimed they offered protection. We had things like copper plates and other objects that were supposed to help spiritually, and the healer told us to remove all of those items and either throw them away or lock them inside the prayer room. He then told us that the main ritual had to be performed at midnight. That night, everyone woke up for the ritual. I remember him drawing a large figure on the ground using turmeric and a white-colored powder. Even today, I can't describe exactly what it looked like. It wasn't clearly human or animal. It was just a strange shape that has stayed in my memory. He started chanting mantras. The only words I clearly remember are Om Shakti Para Shakti. He then made me sit in front of him. He took a few strands of my hair, tied them to a thread, and began asking questions. Who are you? Why are you here? Speak. Tell us what you want. As he kept repeating these questions, something strange happened. Suddenly, a memory from the previous year came back to me with incredible intensity. When I was in 10th grade, I had gone cycling around my neighborhood one evening. It was around 7 p.m. and getting dark. Outside my colony, I noticed a very bright light in the distance, near a fenced area surrounded by trees. I stopped my bicycle and took out my phone because I wanted to take a picture of it. While looking around with my flashlight, I suddenly realized I was standing next to what appeared to be a fresh burial site covered with flowers. The moment I understood what I was looking at, I became terrified and immediately rode home. I hadn't thought much about that incident for a long time, but during the ritual, while the healer was questioning me, that memory completely took over my mind. I couldn't focus on anything else. It felt like my entire attention had locked onto that moment from the past. What scared me most was that I felt an urge to respond to his questions. It was almost as if answers were forming in my mind on their own. I remember feeling like something was trying to speak through me, even though I never actually said anything out loud. I kept my mouth shut the entire time. After the ritual, the healer told my family that it was black magic. As part of the ritual, a goat was sacrificed. The head was buried near the entrance of our property. Lemons with nails driven through them were buried in the four corners of the property, and other ritual steps were performed as well. I'm not sharing this because I'm trying to convince anyone that ghosts, possession, or black magic are real. To this day, I genuinely don't know what happened. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was suggestion. Maybe it was the result of being depressed, emotionally vulnerable, and sitting through an intense ritual where everyone expected something supernatural to happen. Or maybe it was something else entirely. I've never told this full story to most people in my life because I was worried they would think I was crazy. My boss gave me a strict list of rules for the night shift. I just found out why I have to mop the bathroom at exactly 3:15 a.m. Working the graveyard shift at a desolate highway gas station completely strips away your sense of time. The long, cracked stretches of asphalt extending in both directions remain entirely empty for hours. The fluorescent lights overhead hum with a constant, irritating vibration that settles deep into your teeth. I took the job because my bank account was completely depleted, and the owner paid entirely in cash at the end of every single week. He was an older, heavyset man who constantly chewed on unlit cigars and rarely looked me in the eyes when he spoke. During my first night, the owner handed me a heavy wooden clipboard holding a single sheet of lined paper. He tapped his thick finger against the top of the page. "The register automatically locks at midnight," the owner explained. "You only accept cash through the sliding transaction window. You stay behind the bulletproof glass until 6 in the morning." I wrote down the daily tasks. You sweep the aisles, restock the coolers, and wipe down the coffee machines. You follow the list exactly as I wrote it. Do we understand each other? "I understand," I replied, taking the clipboard. "Is there anything else I need to know about the security system?" "The cameras record to a digital drive under the counter," he said, turning toward the heavy glass door. "Do not mess with the drive. Just read the list. Stick to the list, and you will get your envelope on Friday." After he drove away, leaving me completely alone in the I building, I sat on the tall metal stool behind the counter and read the instructions. The first 3 rules were completely standard retail procedures regarding inventory and cleaning schedules. Rule number 4 was written in thick, heavily pressed red ink. If a rusted white van pulls up to pump 2 at 3 a.m., the driver will get out and walk to the transaction window. He will ask for the bathroom key. Give him the heavy brass key hanging on the hook under the register. Do not give him the standard plastic key. When he leaves the property, take the mop and bucket into the bathroom immediately. Clean the floor. Do not touch the water on the tiles with your bare hands. Use the thick rubber gloves provided in the utility closet. I stared at the red ink for a long time. The extreme specificity of the instruction felt deeply unsettling. I assumed it was simply a quirk of the job, perhaps dealing with a regular eccentric local resident who had some kind of medical condition. The deep isolation of the highway breeds strange habits, and I needed the weekly cash far too much to question the logistics of cleaning a bathroom floor. The rusted white van arrived on my 3rd night. I was wiping down the glass surface of the hot dog roller when the harsh headlights cut through the darkness outside. I watched the vehicle pull slowly into the glowing circle of light cast by the overhead canopy. It parked perfectly parallel to the second fuel pump. The engine idled with a rough, choking sputter. The exterior of the van was heavily corroded, the metal eaten away by years of severe rust and neglect. The rear windows were completely blacked out with peeling tint. The driver's door opened with a loud screech. A man stepped out onto the concrete pad. He wore a dark canvas coat and loose jeans. As he walked toward the bulletproof glass of the transaction window, I noticed his heavy boots were leaving wet footprints across the dry pavement. He moved with a slow, dragging gait. I stepped behind the register and waited. The man stopped directly in front of the glass. His appearance sent a wave of adrenaline through my chest. His skin was incredibly pale, bearing a sickly gray pallor that completely lacked the natural flush of circulating blood. His dark hair was entirely plastered to his skull, dripping steadily onto the collar of his heavy coat. He looked as though he had just crawled out of a freezing river. The smell penetrated the small gap in the transaction window immediately. It was a dense, suffocating odor of stagnant water and wet mud. "I need the key," the driver said. "Which one?" I asked, my hands trembling slightly as I reached under the counter. "The heavy key," he replied, staring blankly at my chest. He never made eye contact. I pulled the thick brass key off the hidden hook and slid it through the metal transaction tray. The driver took it with a pale hand. His fingers were severely wrinkled, the skin puckered from extreme water exposure. He turned around and walked slowly toward the exterior bathroom doors, located on the side of the building. I watched the surveillance monitor sitting on the counter. The screen displayed the black and white feed from the camera pointing at the side entrances. I watched the driver insert the heavy brass key, open the door, and step inside into the darkness. Exactly 15 minutes later, the bathroom door opened. The driver emerged, walked back to the transaction window, and dropped the brass key into the metal tray. He did not say a single word. He returned to his rusted van, started the choking engine, and drove away into the darkness of the highway. I grabbed the rubber gloves from the utility closet, filled the yellow plastic mop bucket with hot water and bleach, and walked outside. The freezing night air bit at my face. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped inside. The floor was completely flooded. A layer of dark, murky water covered the white tiles. The smell of stagnant mud and decay was overwhelmingly powerful in the enclosed space. I remembered the rule written in red ink. I kept the thick rubber gloves pulled high over my forearms and began to mop. I wrung the dark water into the bucket, pouring the filthy contents down the utility drain, and scrubbed the tiles until they were completely dry. I locked the door and returned to the safety of the enclosure. This routine continued flawlessly for 6 weeks. Every single night at exactly 3 a.m, the rusted van pulled up to the second pump. The pale driver asked for the heavy key. He went into the bathroom for 15 minutes, returned the key, and drove away. I put on the rubber gloves, mopped the flooded floor, and disposed of the murky water. The repetition of the event slowly eroded my initial terror, transforming the bizarre encounter into just another mundane chore on my nightly checklist. The breaking point happened on a Tuesday night during a relentless rainstorm. The van arrived on schedule. The driver completed his slow, silent transaction and retreated to the side of the building. After he returned the key and drove away into the driving rain, I gathered my cleaning supplies. I pulled the heavy rubber gloves up to my elbows, grabbed the mop, and wheeled the yellow plastic bucket out to the bathroom. I opened the door and flipped on the light. The floor was flooded, bearing the usual layer of dark, foul-smelling water. I set the bucket down near the sink and began to push the mop across the slick tiles. I was exhausted, my muscles aching from the cold dampness of the night. I pushed the waterlogged mop head toward the corner of the room, using entirely too much force. The wooden handle slipped aggressively from my wet grip. The heavy mop collided violently with the side of the yellow bucket. The plastic container tipped entirely over, spilling the mixture of bleach and collected floor water across the tiles in a chaotic splash. I let out a frustrated sigh and crouched down on my knees to right the bucket. As I reached down, I noticed the solid debris scattered across the wet tiles. The dark water left behind by the driver always contained small amounts of grit, but the spill had spread the contents of the bucket out into a thin layer, exposing the larger particles. I leaned closer, inspecting the debris sticking to the wet porcelain of the toilet base. They were long, thick strands of dark green aquatic weeds. The plant matter was slimy, coated in a thick layer of river mud. Scattered among the weeds were several small, jagged fragments of decaying wood and rusted metal fasteners. The smell rising from the spilled water was intensely concentrated. The bleach could not mask the stench. I stood up slowly, a primal unease settling into my stomach. I finished cleaning the floor in a frantic, panicked rush, ensuring I did not touch a single drop of the foul water with my bare skin. I locked the bathroom, sprinted back through the pouring rain, and sealed myself inside the bulletproof enclosure. I sat on the tall metal stool and stared at the surveillance monitor. I thought this time, I wanted to know exactly what the driver was doing inside that room for 15 minutes, every single night. I grabbed the computer mouse and pulled up the digital recording archive. I selected the timestamp for 3 a.m. and pressed play. The black and white footage showed the rusted van pulling up to the pump. The driver stepped out, walked to my window, and then moved toward the side of the building. The camera perfectly captured him inserting the brass key and stepping into the bathroom. The door pulled completely shut behind him. I watched the time code ticking in the bottom corner of the screen. 1 minute passed. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes passed. I stared intensely at the door on the monitor, waiting for the driver to emerge. The time code hit exactly 15 minutes. The camera feed glitched. A thick band of digital static rolled aggressively down the screen, disrupting the video signal for a fraction of a second. When the picture stabilized, the metal bathroom door was completely closed. I frowned, rewinding the footage by 30 seconds. I watched the door again. The static rolled down the screen. The door remained entirely shut. I fast-forwarded the video. The time code advanced to 20 minutes, then 30 minutes. The door never opened. I pulled up the exterior camera pointing at the gas pumps. The rusted white van was sitting next to the second pump at 14 minutes past the hour. At exactly 15 minutes, the camera experienced the exact same burst of digital static. When the picture cleared, the van was completely gone. I pushed the computer mouse away, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The rational, logical part of my brain demanded that I ignore the footage. It demanded that I accept the paycheck and continue mopping the floor. But the horror of the situation completely hijacked my nervous system. I needed to understand the reality of the bathroom. I grabbed the brass key from the hook under the register. I grabbed my flashlight from my backpack and walked back out into the pouring rain. I unlocked the bathroom door and stepped inside, shutting it firmly behind me. I turned off the light, plunging the small room into darkness, and engaged the beam of my flashlight. I swept the bright circle of light across the tiles, the cheap porcelain sink, and the metal toilet stall. The room was entirely mundane. There were no hidden alcoves, no removable ceiling tiles, and absolutely no secondary exits. It was a solid cinder block box. I looked down at the brass key resting in my palm. The teeth on the key were incredibly complex, far too intricate for the cheap, standard commercial lock mounted on the exterior door. The key belonged to a different mechanism. I dropped to my knees on the damp tiles and crawled toward the space directly beneath the sink. The plumbing pipes ran down into the concrete floor, surrounded by a thick rusted metal base plate. I shined the flashlight directly onto the metal plate. Hidden completely on the underside of the heavy iron disc, obscured by decades of accumulated grime and hard water stains, was a small circular keyhole. My breath caught in my throat. I slowly inserted the brass key into the hidden slot. It slid perfectly into place. I gripped the brass bow and turned it forcefully to the right. A loud clack echoed violently beneath the concrete floor. I grabbed the edges of the rusted metal base plate and pulled upward. The entire section of tiled floor beneath the sink lifted smoothly away, revealing a dark square opening plunging straight down into the foundation of the building. A wave of putrid air aggressively rushed up from the hole, carrying the overwhelming, gagging stench of something dead. I aimed my flashlight down into the opening. A narrow rusted iron ladder descended roughly 10 feet into a massive bunker. The beam of light illuminated a horrific, devastating reality. The entire underground space was flooded, holding at least 4 feet of dark, murky river water. Floating completely stagnant on the surface of the foul liquid were dozens of decaying, waterlogged suitcases, torn canvas duffel bags, and children's backpacks. Protruding violently from the dark water, tangled deeply in the thick strands of aquatic river weeds, were human, skeletal remains. There were dozens of them, pale, stained skulls resting against the concrete walls. Rib cages wrapped tightly in decaying, algae-covered clothing. Small, fragile bones sinking deeply into the thick layer of mud coating the floor of the bunker. I fell backward away from the hole, scrambling frantically across the wet bathroom tiles. I covered my mouth with both hands, suppressing a violent surge of nausea, my mind spinning chaotically as the pieces of the nightmare slammed together. A sharp, aggressive knock echoed violently against the exterior bathroom door. My entire body locked into a rigid state of paralysis. I stared wildly at the door. I had locked the deadbolt when I stepped inside. "Who is out there?" I yelled, my voice cracking severely. There was no response. The driving rain continued to beat heavily against the roof of the building. I slowly pushed myself off the floor, keeping the beam of my flashlight trained directly on the door handle. I took a slow, trembling step forward. I reached out, grabbed the cold metal lock, and turned the deadbolt. I pulled the door open and pointed the flashlight directly out into the rain. The concrete walkway was completely empty. The glowing perimeter of the gas station was entirely deserted. I stood in the doorway, staring out into the empty storm, the cold rain blowing aggressively across my face. Then, I heard the sound. It came from directly behind me, originating deep inside the small enclosed space of the bathroom. It was a heavy, dragging footstep, the sickening, squelching sound of a completely waterlogged boot pressing firmly against the wet tile floor. My blood turned entirely to ice. The heavy trapdoor beneath the sink was still wide open. I turned my head slowly, moving with an agonizing and terrified hesitation, shining the beam back into the bathroom. Standing between the open trapdoor and the sink was the driver. He did not look like the pale, dripping man who stood outside the transaction window. His physical form had completely deteriorated into a state of horrifying putrefaction. His body was massively bloated, his skin swollen and stretched tightly over his expanding tissues. The flesh was a sickly, mottled purple, sloughing off his jawbone in thick, wet strips. Dark, murky water poured heavily from his open, rotting mouth, cascading down his chest and soaking into the ruined fabric of his heavy canvas coat. He raised a bloated, decaying hand, the long, jagged fingernails pointing directly at my face. Then he took a dragging step toward me. I abandoned the flashlight, dropped it onto the wet concrete, and sprinted blindly out into the rain. I ran with desperate adrenaline, tearing across the flooded parking lot toward the glass doors of the main building. I heard the aggressive, wet slapping of his dragging boots moving rapidly behind me, closing the distance with a terrifying, unnatural speed. I reached the glass doors, threw my entire body weight against the metal handles, and practically fell into the brightly lit interior. I scrambled wildly behind the main counter, ignoring the transaction window entirely, and threw myself violently against the solid wooden door leading into the owner's private back office. I twisted the heavy brass lock, securing the deadbolt just as a massive, devastating impact slammed aggressively against the other side of the wood. The door shuddered violently on its hinges. A low, gurgling, watery roar echoed heavily through the walls of the gas station. I backed away from the locked door, my chest heaving with deep, frantic gasps for air. The small, windowless office was cluttered with tall metal filing cabinets, stacks of cardboard inventory boxes, and a wooden desk positioned in the center of the room. I pulled my cell phone from my damp pocket. My fingers were shaking so severely I could barely unlock the screen. I pulled up the owner's contact number and pressed the call button, holding the phone tightly against my ear. The call immediately failed. The screen displayed a harsh, no network connection error. The severe storm outside had completely knocked out the cellular towers in the region. I was entirely cut off from the outside world. The wet impacts against the door ceased. The gas station fell into a deep, oppressive silence, broken only by the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. I needed something to defend myself. I began frantically tearing through the cluttered office, pulling open the heavy metal drawers of the filing cabinets, searching desperately for a firearm, a heavy metal tool, or a sharp object. The drawers contained nothing but endless stacks of tax documents, vendor receipts, and old payroll ledgers. I moved to the wooden desk, pulling aggressively on the locked bottom drawer. It refused to open. I grabbed a metal paperweight sitting on the desktop and smashed it violently against the cheap lock mechanism until the wood splintered and gave way. I pulled the drawer open. There was no gun inside. Resting at the bottom of the drawer was a thick, leather-bound notebook and a small iron lockbox. I grabbed the notebook and flipped it open. The pages were filled with the owner's messy, slanted handwriting. It was not an inventory ledger. It was a detailed, methodical accounting of human trafficking. The entries explicitly detailed the owner's highly lucrative side business. He used the isolated location of the gas station as a transfer point for undocumented immigrants being smuggled across the border. The owner used the underground concrete bunker hidden beneath the bathroom as a temporary holding cell, locking the desperate people in the dark, while he collected exorbitant transit fees from their families. I turned the pages rapidly. I stopped on an entry dated exactly 7 years ago. The handwriting in this specific entry was deeply pressed into the paper, frantic and chaotic. The storm breached the levee behind the tree line, the entry read. The runoff flooded the drainage pipes. It backed up directly into the bunker ventilation system. I could hear them screaming from the office. I could hear them beating against the bottom of the trapdoor. The water filled the concrete box in less than 20 minutes. They all drowned in the dark. I am not opening the trapdoor. I am keeping the cash, and the concrete is thick enough to hide the smell. I stared at the page, a profound, sickening realization settling heavily into my brain. I turned to the final, most recent entry in the book. The driver came tonight, the owner had written, the ink slightly smeared by sweat. I think he was one of them. I know that. Because of the white van, I remember him. He was working in delivery with it in his home. Wanted to come here for better life, to provide for his family. Sadly, this is how life goes. They are dead down there, and I am alive here. The problem is he pulled up to the pump at 3 a.m, asked for the key. I think he's still convinced that he is alive, and he wants to open the door and let them out. The dead do not know they are dead. I think he is trapped in the routine, so as long as I give him the brass key, he goes into the bathroom, tries to open the rusted floor plate, and disappears. He just needs to try. As long as I let him run his ghost routine, he does not come into the store, and the new kid can handle the floor. I retreated to the furthest corner of the small room, pressing my back tightly against the cold metal of the filing cabinets. I pulled my knees to my chest, gripping the leather notebook tightly in my trembling hands. The impacts continued against the door for hours. I listened to the horrific, wet, tearing sounds of bloated flesh pressing against the wood. I listened to the low, gurgling moans echoing through the narrow gap. The smell of decay in the office became entirely suffocating, burning the inside of my lungs. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut, praying silently to a universe I barely understood, waiting for the door to finally shatter completely. It never did. The violent assault against the office door abruptly ceased, exactly as the first faint rays of morning sunlight began to bleed through the cracks in the exterior window blinds. The gurgling sounds faded entirely. The wet, dragging footsteps retreated slowly across the floor of the main store, moving toward the exterior doors. I heard the sharp, distant screech of a rusted metal van door, opening and slamming shut. I heard a rough, choking engine start, and the sound of tires rolling away across the wet asphalt. I remained locked in the office for another complete hour, utterly terrified that the silence was a trap. When the wall clock hit 7 in the morning, I finally stood up, unlocked the deadbolt, and slowly pushed the splintered door open. The gas station was completely empty. The floors were heavily stained with dark, foul-smelling mud, and thick puddles of murky river water covered the linoleum. But the bloated driver was gone. The owner always arrived for the morning shift at exactly 8 o'clock to collect the cash register deposits. I walked behind the counter, picked up the main landline phone, and dialed emergency services. The landline connection was perfectly stable. I explicitly told the dispatcher to send multiple units to the gas station immediately. I told them exactly where to find the trapdoor under the bathroom sink. I sat on the tall metal stool and waited. The police cruisers arrived in a chaotic flurry of flashing lights and wailing sirens, just as the owner's heavy pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. I walked out of the building, handed the thick leather notebook directly to the cops, and pointed silently toward the heavy-set owner standing by his truck. I watched the color drain completely from his face as the police officers read the ledger. I watched them place the steel handcuffs over his wrists and shove him forcefully into the back of a patrol car. I gave a lengthy, exhaustive statement to the authorities at the precinct. I detailed the evidence of the bunker, the notebook, and the financial ledgers. I completely omitted any mention of the dripping, rotting revenant or the haunted routine. The police did not need ghost stories to secure a conviction. The massive flooded tomb hidden beneath the foundation was more than enough evidence to put the owner in a concrete cell for the rest of his life. I am unemployed again, and my bank account is still empty, but I do not care. I am alive. I keep thinking about the rusted white van pulling away from the gas station in the early morning light. The trapdoor in the bathroom was finally opened. The horrific secret was entirely exposed, and the man responsible for the atrocity was dragged away in chains. I stare at the ceiling of my apartment, listening to the morning rain hit my window. And I truly hope the driver finally got his closure. I hope the drowned souls resting in the dark can finally leave the bunker. Don't go off trail in the Appalachians. I know what's waiting for you. Last May, Search and rescue teams in the Appalachian National Forest found a shattered smartphone lodged in a narrow rock crevice, 100 feet below a steep cliff. The device was protected by a heavy-duty OtterBox case, which kept the internal memory intact despite the fall. Here is what this device recorded in its final hours. And these are the words left behind by its owner before he vanished completely. My battery is at 15% now. I don't know if anyone will ever hear this, but I have to leave my testimony. My name is Mark, and I thought a hiking trip in the Appalachians would just be a routine getaway to escape the grind of life in Philadelphia. On the third day, I decided to go off trail, looking for total isolation, but I realize now that I made a fatal mistake. I went so deep into the woods that I lost all cell service, and that's when I started noticing things a regular tourist wouldn't. The trees here aren't normal. They're so thick they block out the sun, and the forest floor smells like something is buried beneath it. I saw strange symbols carved into the oak trunks with a knife. Fresh wounds, still oozing resin like markers to claim territory or a warning. I stopped to catch my breath, and when I looked back, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't just a feeling. I heard a twig snap, followed by the sound of heavy, labored breathing. It didn't sound like any wild animal. It was distinct, ragged human breathing. Gray clouds gathered over the peaks, and the fog started creeping in like a snake, blanketing everything in a pale, ghostly gray. I tried to make it back to the main trail I'd left hours ago, but I noticed the carved symbols were repeating with an eerie consistency, as if they were guiding me somewhere, or warning me that I was already inside someone's hunting ground. My heart started pounding with every step. In this place, sound travels for miles, and every step I took felt like announcing my position. I pulled out my paper map to check my bearing, but I was shocked to find that the area I was in wasn't clearly marked. It was like a blank spot forgotten by the world. Then I saw it on the horizon over one of the ridges, a faint trail of smoke. Rising slowly, it looked like a campsite, but I knew I was in a restricted area where camping was prohibited for security reasons. Every instinct was screaming at me to run the other way, but exhaustion had taken its toll, and the fog was so thick I'd completely lost my sense of direction. I realize now that these mountains aren't just rocks and trees. They're one giant trap, and I may have walked myself into a place no one ever comes back from. I approached the smoke cautiously, hoping to find a woodsman or someone seeking shelter. But what I saw was a waking nightmare. There was an old dilapidated trailer, covered in black plastic tarps, surrounded by a fence of barbed wire that looked like it was meant to keep something in, not keep people out. There were no animals, no birds chirping, just a terrifying silence hanging over the place like a graveyard. I crept closer and I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. Worn-out shoes, open backpacks, scattered clothes that looked like they belonged to different people, all of them human trophies. I realized then that this wasn't a camp. It was a graveyard for the missing hikers I'd read about in the news. Suddenly I heard the sound of a metal lock clicking inside the trailer. I froze behind a massive oak trunk and grabbed my phone. No service, as usual in this terrain. A man stepped out of the trailer. He wasn't carrying a gun, he was carrying a woodsman's axe, and his face was covered by a filthy rag. He started scanning the ground, sniffing the air like a hunting dog picking up a scent. He moved with an unnatural agility for a man his age, gliding over roots and rocks without making a sound. I saw him stop at the exact spot I'd been standing minutes before. He looked down, then looked straight toward my tree. It wasn't a coincidence. He'd been tracking me since I entered the area. He started walking toward me, slowly, dragging the axe along the tree trunks, like he was marking his prey. I couldn't breathe. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my feet felt rooted in the mud. I realized this man lives here, kills here, and hides his victims in this eternal fog. And the law is hundreds of miles away beyond these high peaks. He was smiling under his mask, a smile I saw in his cold, unblinking eyes, as if he'd been waiting for a new visitor for a long time. My phone battery is blinking red now, 8%. I'm not recording this to call for help. I know no one will get here in time. I'm recording this so everyone knows these woods aren't safe, and there are human monsters living among us far from the city lights. I saw how he touched that axe, how he sniffed the air. This man doesn't kill for money or theft. He kills because this place has given him the power to toy with other people's lives. I can hear him now, talking to himself in gibberish, like he's performing some old ritual before the final hunt begins. I can't stay here. I started running with everything I had, not looking back. Tree branches scratched my face, and the sharp mountain rocks tore through my boots. The sound of his footsteps behind me never stopped. Steady, rhythmic, and constant, like he never gets tired. I entered a steep, rocky slope where the fog was hugging the ground. Suddenly, the sound of his footsteps vanished. I stopped to listen, thinking I'd lost him. But then I heard a voice, coming from above, from behind the rocks I'd just climbed. He was humming an old folk tune, his voice echoing through the mountains like a terrifying chorus. He wasn't chasing me. He was herding me toward a well-known cliff in these mountains, an area that ends in a sheer drop to certain death. I tried to change course, but I found myself trapped against a vertical rock wall. I was pinned between him and certain death. He emerged from the fog, calm, wiping his axe, and looked at me like I was just a minor hurdle in his day. He didn't say a word. He raised the axe, and I backed up until my heel touched the edge of the cliff. I looked down. Pitch black, no bottom in sight. I looked at him and saw my own fear reflected in his eyes. I realized these mountains choose their victims. He pushed me, not with his hand, but with his overwhelming presence and a sudden move. My phone slipped out of my pocket into a rock crevice while I was trying to cling to the cliff, and I can't get it back, but I'll leave it here. Maybe someone will find it someday. He's closing in. There's no way out. I'm going to jump before he touches me. At least I'll choose how I die. If you're hearing this, stay away from the unmarked trails in the Appalachians. They're watching from between the trees, and they're waiting for their next visitor. The battery's dying. Goodbye.